Imagine a state leader whose signature controls budgets, law enforcement coordination, emergency responses, and the political machinery that keeps a state running. Lieutenant Governor, a role built on public trust, a position treated as the final checkpoint before the governor's office. For most citizens, that title symbolizes stability. But in this case, it masked one of the deepest infiltrations of organized crime into state government in recent memory. 2 weeks before her name would spread across national headlines, Lieutenant Governor Helena Rourke was known only as a disciplined, sharp-spoken official. She won elections easily, commanded committee hearings with an iron voice, and cultivated the image of a relentless reformer. To the public, she was efficiency personified. To colleagues, she was a rising force. But to a small circle of federal analysts, her picture-perfect reputation had started to fracture. Patterns emerged: unusual port waivers, irregular zoning approvals, unexplained rerouting of Gulf shipments. The deeper the analysts dug, the clearer it became. These anomalies aligned with the movements of a fictional but highly organized cartel known as Círculo de la Noche. This cartel did not rely on alleyway dealers or chaotic street violence. Its strength came from paperwork, logistics, trade routes, and the quiet manipulation of state systems. And Helena Rourke, investigators feared, was not just influenced by them, she was enabling them. The rupture began at 4:19 a.m. on a cold Thursday morning outside Baton Rouge. The neighborhood was silent, the sky still black. A row of unmarked federal vehicles rolled past trimmed hedges and sleeping homes. Inside the lead SUV sat a joint FBI-DHS task force specializing in public corruption. No raised voices, no excitement, just the steady, controlled breathing of agents who knew the scale of what they were about to uncover. Rourke's mansion looked immaculate. White columns, warm porch lights glowing from a timer, an image of suburban security. But investigators had spent 8 months mapping encrypted exchanges, offshore transfers, shell accounts, and Port Authority signatures that pointed directly to her office. When the battering ram hit the front door, the blast echoed across the cul-de-sac like distant thunder. Agents swept inside with precision. The first anomaly appeared in the finished basement, where a support column sounded hollow. A magnetic tool revealed the truth: a false wall. Behind it, they found 74 pounds of pharmaceutical-grade fentanyl, vacuum-sealed in industrial canisters disguised as chemical filtration units. Nearby, a locked steel case held 5 customized rifles, each with suppressed configurations and removed serial numbers. Inside another safe, agents counted $7.1 million in sealed cash bands, each stack marked with Círculo's internal coding system. But none of that compared to what they found upstairs. On her desk, next to legislative briefing folders, lay Rourke's work phone, unlocked. Inside it were encrypted chat histories tied to an alias known within the cartel as La Madrina del Paso, the godmother of the corridor. The messages detailed shipment schedules, evasion strategies, inspection manipulation, and coordinated delays across multiple state agencies. One message chilled investigators: 14 containers cleared. Route them before the audit. I will redirect oversight. This was not mere corruption. This was direction, strategic, deliberate, and embedded at the highest level of state power. By sunrise, 3 evidence trucks stood outside Rourke's mansion. Neighbors gathered in silence, confused, whispering to one another. They recognized her from campaign posters, community events, ribbon cuttings. She had shaken their hands, promised integrity, spoken about protecting families from narcotics. Now agents carried out crates covered in evidence tags. What stunned federal teams most was not the scale of the drugs or the cash, but the structural penetration. Rourke had authority over budget committees that influenced port enforcement operations. She appointed members of the State Transportation Board. She held direct access to emergency coordination protocols. And according to the messages recovered that morning, she had been using every one of those levers to build a clean, unchallenged corridor for the cartel. Before the sun fully lit the neighborhood, Washington had already been notified. Rourke was detained under federal supervision, her communication devices seized, her staff quietly removed from state offices. And analysts, standing over tables of evidence, realized the truth. Helena Rourke did not simply open doors for the cartel. She had constructed an entire highway. The raid on Helena Rourke's home was not the end of the investigation. It was the detonation point. By the time the sun had fully risen, federal command centers were already filling with analysts, supervisors, and attorneys trying to understand how deeply a lieutenant governor had managed to embed a criminal network inside the state she was sworn to protect. The governor's office released a short, sterile statement about ongoing legal matters. But inside the state capitol, the reaction was far from calm. Staffers locked their office doors. Senior advisors whispered behind half-closed blinds. Legislative aides quietly removed their badges and went home early. Everyone understood that a scandal involving a lieutenant governor was not a story contained to one office. Something this large always had roots. Federal analysts wasted no time. They began dismantling Rourke's digital footprint piece by piece. What they uncovered was not a collection of careless messages or ordinary misconduct, but an entire architecture of coded communication. Her cloud records revealed layers of encrypted files embedded inside budget proposals and legislative drafts. Her email patterns followed the timing structures the cartel used to synchronize freight movement along the Gulf. Even her meeting calendar, once thought to be routine administrative clutter, showed recurring sessions that lined up precisely with unexplained routing changes at two major ports. The turning point came when investigators accessed a concealed archive, hidden inside a seemingly mundane folder labeled Revision Tasks. Once decrypted, it exposed a blueprint of coordinated manipulation. Each document detailed a specific node in the state's transportation system, from highway weigh stations to port inspection gates. Next to each location were subtle annotations intended to look administrative, but, when combined, formed a clear operational map. Adjusting inspector schedules to create blind windows, initiating maintenance reviews that conveniently stalled enforcement, reallocating emergency funds to disguise bypass operations. Every line demonstrated intent, precision, and a level of influence only a lieutenant governor could wield. While analysts reconstructed the digital trail, tactical teams moved on physical targets. Late that afternoon, agents descended on a warehouse complex outside Lake Charles, one of the shell company properties traced through Rourke's encrypted correspondence. From the outside, it looked deserted, just a gray slab of concrete with rusting gates and a flickering light above the loading bay. But the moment the doors were breached, the truth revealed itself. The interior was humming like a quiet machine, a fully operational distribution hub, hidden behind a facade of abandonment. Pallets were arranged in precise rows, crates stacked with industrial symmetry, ventilation fans running just enough to keep the air circulating without drawing attention. Inside the first cracked crate, agents found vacuum-sealed fentanyl bricks, stamped with the cartel's insignia. Not a handful, not a small stash, but an amount consistent with regional distribution. By the time the warehouse was cleared, more than 190 pounds had been cataloged, each package coded in the same format discovered in the safe at Rourke's home. But the real shock wasn't the drugs or the money. It was the server room in the back office. The servers were still warm, indicating recent activity. When digital forensics specialists accessed the drives, they found routing data for multiple Gulf Coast ports, as well as internal inspection schedules that only state-level authorization could provide. These files connected directly to Helena Rourke's appointment calendars and approval signatures. As the evidence piled up, the emerging picture became impossible to dismiss. The lieutenant governor had not merely accepted bribes or facilitated isolated favors. She had constructed, maintained, and protected a functional narcotics corridor running directly through her own state. Every decision she made in public had a shadow version running beneath it. Every speech about public safety masked the quiet movement of cartel shipments, and every administrative change she authorized nudged the corridor further into place. By evening, federal agencies had stopped thinking in terms of corruption and started thinking in terms of infiltration. And for the first time, analysts realized that what they uncovered in Lake Charles was likely only the beginning. By the next morning, the investigation had outgrown the boundaries of a single state. What began as a raid on a lieutenant governor's home had become a multi-state intelligence crisis, spreading across federal command centers like a shockwave. Overnight, analysts compiled a preliminary map of the cartel's infiltration, and for the first time, they understood the scale of what Helena Rourke had engineered. Her actions did not merely influence local logistics, they had shifted the balance of narcotics movement across the entire Gulf region. Federal teams traced her encrypted exchanges back nearly 4 years. Each message aligned with a key decision in state infrastructure: the sudden reassignment of a port oversight officer, the unexplained suspension of a highway drug interdiction program, the quiet approval of a new commercial shipping lane. None of these actions caused alarm at the time. They were buried under administrative language and framed as routine adjustments. But in hindsight, they formed a perfect pattern. Every shift opened a corridor. Every delay created a blind spot. Every signature smoothed the path for incoming containers that no one inspected at the right moment. At dawn, agents launched coordinated warrants across 3 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, targeting properties linked to shell companies tied to Rourke's network. The first warehouse in Mobile appeared to be just another aging steel structure near the docks. But inside, investigators found an entire room padded with soundproof insulation, converted into a packaging center. Tables were still covered in powder residue. Industrial vacuum sealers were plugged in and warmed to the touch. Dozens of plastic barrels contained chemical precursors disguised as agricultural additives. In one corner, a stack of false bottom cargo pallets waited to be loaded. In Biloxi, agents raided a coastal storage yard registered to a fictitious construction supplier. Beneath tarps and rusting machinery, they found a concealed freight container built with double walls. Between the metal layers were thin packets of fentanyl paste, hundreds of them, wrapped in heat-resistant foil. Evidence markers piled up faster than investigators could place them. What unsettled them most was that every hiding method showed sophistication, precision, and consistency. This was not the work of couriers improvising hiding spaces. This was an industrial process. Meanwhile, the digital teams working through the night uncovered a new layer of Rourke's operation. Her devices contained a secondary encryption system built on hidden text fragments inside public documents. State press releases, transportation bulletins, and legislative memos included invisible metadata strings, seemingly harmless formatting code, used by the cartel to embed routing instructions. Anyone reading the documents saw ordinary government language. Anyone with the matching decryption key saw the schedule for the next shipment. It became clear that Rourke had transformed her office into a communications channel, one that disguised cartel planning as governmental paperwork. Even federal cyber analysts, used to combing through dark web networks, admitted they had never seen a system this deeply blended into legitimate state operations. But the most explosive discovery didn't come from a warehouse or a server. It came from a device seized from one of Rourke's senior aides, a tablet containing a mirrored cache of her encrypted messages. Buried in the archives was a thread labeled only Coordination, Northern Extension. The contents described meetings in plain language, briefings with the transportation director, a lunch with a port commissioner, an evening review session with 2 members of a highway inspection board. Not one of those meetings appeared on the official state calendar. The messages made it unmistakable. Rourke wasn't working alone. She had cultivated a quiet circle inside multiple agencies, officials who provided her with access, timing, and maneuverability. Some likely believed they were helping facilitate commerce. Others, perhaps, understood exactly what they were enabling. Before noon, Federal Command had to confront a possibility they initially resisted. The network inside the State House was larger than anyone had feared. Decisions once dismissed as bureaucratic inefficiencies now looked like deliberate acts of sabotage. Years of unexplained enforcement failures snapped into focus. The scandal was no longer something that could be contained. It was expanding, and every new discovery suggested that Helena Rourke's influence within the cartel was far greater than investigators had imagined. She wasn't a politician compromised by criminals. She was a political architect who had designed an invisible highway through American infrastructure. And she had done it in plain sight. By the time federal teams stabilized their command centers and prepared formal briefings, the story had already spiraled into a national crisis. Cable networks aired aerial footage of warehouses, flashing lights, sealed evidence trucks, and endless lines of agents entering and exiting buildings. Governors from neighboring states demanded updates. Congressional committees scheduled emergency sessions. And inside Washington, senior officials struggled to comprehend how a lieutenant governor, someone with ceremonial duties on the surface but immense structural power underneath, had managed to construct a secret narcotics corridor without raising alarms for nearly half a decade. But the largest shock came that evening. when investigators finished indexing the final contents of the tablets seized from Rourke's aide. A cluster of files, previously unreadable, finally decrypted after a prolonged brute force attempt. Inside were operational summaries, monthly briefings written not for the cartel, but by the cartel, analyzing their own penetration into government systems. Each summary graded officials on reliability, risk exposure, and adaptability under pressure. Some names were listed without comment, others with extended notes, and one designation appeared repeatedly: Primary Shield, HR. No title, no explanation. Just 2 letters that confirmed what investigators had suspected. Helena Rourke was not a peripheral accomplice. She was the keystone. The next morning, a joint task force launched the most significant phase of the operation. At sunrise, coordinated arrests swept through state and municipal buildings across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. A transportation director was taken into custody at his home before stepping out for his morning jog. A port commissioner from Pascagoula was detained during a scheduled board meeting. 2 highway inspection supervisors were escorted out of their office by federal agents as stunned employees watched in silence. Each arrest triggered another lead, another signature, another unexplained decision buried somewhere in years of bureaucratic records. Inside the state capitol, chaos erupted. Staffers whispered into phones, unsure which rumors were real. Security teams sealed off several floors. Legislative committees were suspended, and in one office, a senior advisor sat motionless as agents removed stacks of documents she did not know had been altered. The Capitol felt less like a government building and more like a breached fortress where no one knew where the next opening would appear. Meanwhile, forensic accountants uncovered the financial backbone of Rourke's involvement. Her public salary and disclosed assets painted the picture of an ordinary official's life. But in offshore banking systems, investigators found a second identity built on a maze of shell corporations stretching from Belize to Luxembourg. These companies, all hollow on paper, funneled millions through consulting contracts, environmental study grants, and infrastructure planning funds, payments choreographed to appear as legitimate public-private partnerships. Every transfer reinforced the same conclusion. The lieutenant governor had used government projects as both cover and currency. But even as evidence mounted, investigators struggled to understand one question. How had Rourke kept something this large, this coordinated, and this structurally integrated from collapsing under its own weight? The answer came from surveillance logs recovered in Mobile. Hidden in a back office was a small metal safe containing a binder labeled simply "Assurance." Inside were printouts of private communications, emails, text fragments, personal schedules, belonging to a variety of state officials. The binder revealed subtle leverage points, a commissioner's undisclosed conflict of interest, a supervisor's misuse of state vehicles, a director's concealed disciplinary file. None of the issues were catastrophic alone, but each one was enough to ensure compliance when needed. Rourke's network, it turned out, was not built on loyalty. It was built on quiet pressure. Light enough to avoid detection, heavy enough to guarantee cooperation. By late afternoon, federal commanders believed they had finally mapped the full depth of the infiltration, but that confidence lasted only 2 hours. At 5:11 p.m., analysts in the cybersecurity division decrypted the last remaining fragments found on Rourke's phone. What they uncovered forced the entire task force to reconvene. The messages didn't describe the Gulf Coast corridor. They described expansion. There were references to logistics centers in Tennessee, covert meetings in Arkansas, and long-term plans to shift operations deeper into the Midwest. A phrase repeated several times captured the gravity of what they now faced. The southern branch is complete. Begin aligning the northern routes. It was not a drug operation disguised as government work. It was a government infrastructure roadmap, repurposed into a cartel blueprint. By nightfall, the realization settled over the task force with a cold weight. They had not disrupted a fully built network. They had caught it mid-evolution. At the precise moment it was preparing to scale beyond anything the Gulf region had ever seen. And at the center of that expansion, at the origin point of every decision, every signature, every rerouted shipment and concealed inspection schedule, was the lieutenant governor whose office still appeared immaculate from the outside. Her nameplate undisturbed, her documents neatly aligned on the desk where she had shaped both policy and corruption with the same calm hand. The next chapter would not be political fallout. It would be national reckoning. By dawn the following day, the investigation had entered a phase that no one inside the command center dared call the end. What unraveled over the past 48 hours was not a story with a clean conclusion, but the exposure of a machine that had been running in plain sight, disguised as public service. Yet the time had come for the final step, turning a collapsed shadow network into a documented case, one that could withstand courtrooms, scrutiny, and the weight of history. Lieutenant Governor Helena Rourke was transferred to a federal detention facility under high-security protocols. She did not speak during processing. She did not request an attorney. She did not ask for a phone call. She simply watched her surroundings with the same calm, analytical expression she carried during legislative hearings. Agents who escorted her noted the same detail. There was no panic, no denial, only calculation, as if she were already analyzing the next move. Inside the interrogation room, federal prosecutors laid out the preliminary evidence. Photographs of seized fentanyl shipments, maps of coordinated port delays, financial records showing the flow of millions through offshore accounts, encrypted messages connecting her directly to the cartel's logistics wing. Rourke remained silent through all of it, not a single acknowledgement. At one point she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and closed her eyes as if listening to music only she could hear. While she refused to speak, others did not. Across the Gulf region, arrests triggered a cascade of confessions. A transportation director admitted to approving routing changes in exchange for monthly payments. A port supervisor described subtle pressure from Rourke's office to prioritize efficiency during container inspections. A senior aide confessed that he had deleted dozens of sensitive memos at her request, believing them to be political strategy notes. Each confession added another brick to the mountain of evidence forming against the lieutenant governor. But the most devastating testimony came from a former logistics consultant who had operated as a liaison between several shell companies. Under federal protection, he revealed how the cartel evaluated public officials, how they identified vulnerabilities, and how Rourke became their ideal asset, ambitious enough to reach power, disciplined enough to maintain secrecy, and influential enough to shape the very systems meant to stop them. Even with the confessions, the fallout spread far beyond the criminal case. The state capitol remained in a state of paralysis. Legislative functions stalled. Committees froze. Emergency meetings stretched through the night as officials attempted to assess which government operations had been compromised. Agencies that once processed thousands of documents a week now audited every page. And in communities across the state, people questioned how deeply corruption had rooted itself in the institutions they depended on. The national response grew just as intense. Congressional hearings were announced within hours. Federal watchdogs launched parallel reviews of transportation oversight. Governors across the region demanded briefings. Public pressure surged as families who had lost loved ones to fentanyl overdoses demanded accountability, arguing that the network Rourke helped create had fueled the very epidemic politicians claimed to fight. In Washington, a senior official summarized the crisis during an internal briefing. This was not a drug pipeline. This was a governmental redesign. Yet, amid the chaos, analysts found something unexpected when combing through Rourke's encrypted archives. In a folder mislabeled as a fiscal analysis draft, they found a document unlike the others. It was not a routing schedule, not a budget manipulation, not a coded instruction. It was a handwritten note, scanned and saved. 6 words, written in her exact script. If systems bend once, they break. Investigators debated the meaning. Was it a warning, a justification, a statement of philosophy, or evidence of how she viewed the government she served, not as a structure of laws, but as an instrument waiting to be modified? As the days passed, the scale of the case crystallized. Courts prepared indictments for more than 100 individuals across 3 states. Task forces built timelines stretching years into the past. Journalists broadcast nightly updates. Families argued at town halls. Politicians mourned the collapse of public trust, while privately fearing what new revelations might surface. Through it all, Helena Rourke remained silent. Her courtroom hearing drew national attention. Cameras waited outside as she was led in, head high, hands cuffed, face unreadable. When the charges were read, conspiracy, narcotics trafficking, corruption, money laundering, abuse of office, obstruction, she did not flinch. When the prosecutor described the deaths linked to fentanyl move through her corridors, she stared forward without reaction. And when the judge denied bail, she simply turned and walked out with the same calm stride she once used when entering the Capitol chambers. In the weeks that followed, the nation slowly began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Agencies launched reforms. Oversight committees restructured. Inspection protocols were rewritten from the ground up. But these institutional repairs did little to cushion the truth that now hung in the air like dust after an explosion. The greatest damage was not the drugs seized or the money uncovered. It was the collapse of faith. Faith in the idea that the law was protected by those entrusted to guard it. Faith that officials acted in service of the public rather than their own ambitions. Faith that government systems, however imperfect, still held a line. Because what the Rourke case revealed was something darker than corruption. It showed how easily a determined individual could turn the machinery of government into a weapon. How infrastructure meant to protect communities could be reshaped into a conduit of harm. How, when trust bends even once, the entire system can crack. But the investigation also uncovered something else, something quieter, less dramatic, but just as important. Agents who followed the case spoke about the analysts who noticed small inconsistencies, the officers who questioned irregular schedules, the staffers who flagged suspicious documents. People who refused to look away, even when the corruption was hidden behind polished speeches and official titles. In the end, the story of Helena Rourke was not only about betrayal, it was also about exposure, about accountability, about the uncomfortable truth that vigilance is not a task reserved for government. It is a responsibility shared by everyone who chooses to see what others ignore. And in a state shaken to its core, that truth became the final lesson. Corruption survives in silence. Justice begins the moment someone decides to speak.